Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Art Like Everything Else, the podcast. I'm your host, Simone, and this week we're going to be talking about a love ethic. So, now for some of you, the concept of a love ethic might sound familiar, and for others, this might be entirely new. For everyone, though, I'm going to be sharing the lens through which I will be navigating today's conversation or discussion. So, I got the concept of a love ethic from reading the book All About Love, New Visions by Bell Hooks. According to Hooks, a love ethic presupposes that everyone has the right to be free, to live fully and well. And so Hooks talks about how living by such an ethic can greatly benefit all those who do so. She talks about how it is possible for you to change lives through love and that your life can become more joyous and fulfilling. But even still, after saying all that, how might living by or cultivating a love ethic actually work? One way that might look is by utilizing all dimensions of love in our everyday lives. So the dimensions of love used in the book are as follows: care, commitment, trust, responsibility, respect, and knowledge. Now maybe you're wondering what that might look like. And for that, I'm going to jump right into our first piece of art. Now, of the 6 dimensions discussed earlier, I'm going to talk about 3 that are present in our first work of art. So our first work of art is the movie It's Wonderful Life. This is an old film that was directed by Frank Capra, and it was released in 1946. Which, in doing my research for this episode, I found out that the movie is based on a short story. I believe it's like Great Something. I forget the actual name of the short story. But that short story was loosely based off of A Christmas Carol, in which I found that how to kind of be pretty interesting, personally. So anyway, to give a brief description without spoiling the movie too much, so It's a Wonderful Life follows a man named George Bailey who's ready to give up on life, and he receives an intervention from an angel who takes him on a journey to see how many lives that George Bailey has kind of affected. Now, in watching this movie, there were a few dimensions through which we see George Bailey utilizing love in his everyday life. Now I will be spoiling a few scenes in the movie to showcase those dimensions. So if you like a spoiler-free watch of the movie, feel free to pause this and go watch the movie. I will warn you though, it is a product of its time. How movies were paced in the 1940s are very different than how movies are paced now. So that is just sort of like the forewarning. It's not entirely terrible, but it is very obviously a movie from the 1940s. So we can see the dimension of trust show up in this movie very early on in the movie. As a child, George saves his boss, a pharmacist, from poisoning a customer by refusing to deliver the medicine as instructed. He trusts that Mr. Gower, that's the name of the pharmacist, didn't mean to do that, and that he was distracted by the bad news that he received early in the day. So it was through this dimension of love, of respect, that not only did George save the life of the customer, he also preserved the livelihood of his boss. We see the dimension of responsibility show up in George deciding to run his father's business after his passing. So up until this point in the movie, George had been dreaming about traveling the world before going to college. There are so many scenes of him talking about wanting to be an adventurer, talking about all the different places in the world that he want to see. And so George had been dreaming of traveling the world since he was a literal child. And just as he was about to do just that, his father passes. And the only way for the family business to stay in the family is for George to stay behind and run the business. And so, even though he had his bags packed and he was on his way to leave, he decided to stay. He decided to take on that responsibility of running the family business in the meantime, instead of pursuing his dreams and going, traveling the world and then going to college. And so, yeah, practicing the responsibility dimension of love allowed for George to help his family, and then doing so kind of help the people of the town, because his family runs a building and loan place. And so a lot of people's money and their homes are kind of tied up in that family business. And if that family business kind of goes, then a lot of people in the town would actually lose their homes. And so we even see the dimension of respect show up in George denying a better high-paying job with Henry Potter. So Henry Potter is this like he's like one of the board members who's trying to buy up literally everything and kind of like just put crappy conditions, doing whatever he can to kind of make as much money as possible. And so Henry Potter wants to destroy like the Bailey family business so that like he can of course get even more money and have even more people in his pocket. And so George actually denies a better high paying job from Potter, um, who wants to destroy that family business and kind of like harm all of the people who he's working with. And so like out of respect for those people and those in his community, George declines that higher pay position and keeps his business open even though it is kind of struggling at that moment. And it is through this love dimension um, of respect that he saves the money and homes for those who he chose to do business with him and his family over the years. Now, we still have a few other dimensions through which love can show up, and I'd like to discuss those using our next work of art. I have at least 3 other dimensions of love to discuss, and I'm going to do just that with this piece of art. So, this next piece of art that we will be discussing is Amelie. And to give a brief description without spoiling it too much, Amelie is a French movie released in 2001 that follows the life of Amelie, who's a little girl who grows up and becomes a waitress who seeks to make other people's lives better. Now, of course, kind of like the last piece of art, to discuss the actual dimensions of love that we see in the movie, that we see Amelie use in her everyday life, we're going to need to discuss some scenes in detail. And so if you like a spoiler-free watch of the movies, feel free to pause and go watch the movie. And for those who say it or who don't mind, we're going to keep going. So with that being said, let's get started. So the dimension of care is shown in Amelie in several ways. One of my favorite ways, is how she tapes bits of TV for her older neighbor who had to become a recluse because of his disability. So like he has a brittle bone disease and he's not able to leave his apartment. Like he has to pad all the furniture and everything. Like it's very difficult for him to like exist out in the world. And so she takes it upon herself to like record bits of TV for him to watch in his apartment because he's really like somewhat out of the loop when it comes to like what's going on and happening, in the everyday world because he spends so much of his time like painting and stuff that he doesn't pay attention or like watch normal TV. But but in her doing this, she showed care for an aging and elderly individual who did not have many opportunities to be cared for otherwise. Amelie, Amelie practices the dimension of knowledge by taking in all the information she does to help those around her. So she uses what she learned about a downed flight that was carrying a mail from several years before to get the idea to write a letter to the landlord or like I think building manager of her apartment so that she's not as sad about what happened to her deceased husband as much. So this gave the building manager, who all throughout the movie had kind of been really depressed and really sad, a chance to move forward and get a more positive outlook on life. And the last dimension that can be found is that of commitment. And Amelie practices this in the movie most with her father. So she goes to see him every Sunday after she's moved out. And upon discovering that he always wanted to travel and he still hasn't, Amelie commits to a plan that encourages her father to get out and see the world. And so she does this by having her flight attendant friend take pictures of like his garden home all around the world. So this commitment to keeping her father company and encouraging him to pursue something he's always wanted to do showed to like bring both Amelie and her father some joy. And I find what happened in both our first piece of art and this one to be incredibly cool. And I'm going to talk about it a bit more in our next section. Incredibly cool that I found about both of these pieces that it would absolutely be possible for you to find all 6 dimensions of love in both movies. So just as we discussed the trust, responsibility, and respect in It's a Wonderful Life, examples of care, commitment, and knowledge could also be found. Also, just as we discussed care, commitment, and knowledge in Amelie, instances of trust, responsibility, and respect can also be found. So both of these characters did use the the 6 dimensions of love in their everyday lives. And in both of these movies, we see how both Amelie and George Bailey, in using these dimensions of love in their everyday lives, were able to change lives through that love, and their own lives became more joyous and fulfilling. A quote from Bell Hooks, a quote that Bell Hooks uses in her book comes from Erich Fromm, a philosopher and a social psychologist from the 1950s, I believe. And the quote reads, "Society must be organized in such a way that man's social loving nature is not separated from his social existence, but becomes one with it." And I want to use that quote to talk about how we might build and cultivate our own love ethic. If we wish to live in that society that Fromm mentioned, what are some things we can do? So we can, of course, just like Amelie and George Bailey, utilize all of the dimensions of love in our everyday lives. How might we show we care in our everyday lives? How might we show commitment in our everyday lives? How might we show trust in our everyday lives? How might we show responsibility, respect, knowledge? How might we show all of those things in our everyday lives? And if you have any ideas, I'd love to hear them. Drop them in the comments below. I believe we can get ideas from each other. I think we should definitely learn about the various ways we can show up for ourselves and our communities and be able to live more joyous and fulfilling lives. And because I believe that's a pursuit well worth it. Now, in both movies, both of our main characters definitely lived in a way where they did put themselves on the back burner. And I don't think that is a necessary step. I believe that personally, I do believe that balance is possible, and that cultivating and embracing a love ethic and honoring our own needs does not have to be mutually exclusive. But sure, we can do things individually. How might it look to see a love ethic embraced on a societal level? In the book, Bell Hooks offers a really good example. She talks about how we can utilize what we do have to encourage or get the powers that be to also mirror and model the love ethic in our media and across society. And what we have that they might find most valuable is our attention. So we can demand that our mass media portray the reality of love and the type of love that we want people to have. So by not watching the movies that they're putting out to try to get us to live a very specific way, by not giving them our attention for very specific things, we can encourage them to only put out the type of material that we would want to see by only giving the material we want to see that attention. And now, so that was just one of the ways that Bell Hooks said we could potentially address this, and in doing that, what we can in our communities are also valuable. So even if you are only able to, well, I think even just being able to practice the 6 dimensions of love in your everyday life can absolutely enrich your life. And also only paying attention to the things that you actually want to see in the media will also be very enriching. I think there's a way that we can all show up where we change lives through love and we live more joyous and fulfilling lives as a result. We see what not living by a love ethic can be in a lot of our media. Maybe living by a love ethic too can be in art like everything else. For this week's All Moment, a cool piece of art that I'd like to talk about for this week's moment is The Art of Loving by Erich Fromm. So this book was released in the 1950s, and while it is definitely somewhat of a product of its time, it is still very relevant today. So this book is actually what Bell Hooks was referencing in the All About Love book. And so because while I was reading and prepping for this episode, I decided why not read the book she was referencing. And I did, and I actually really, really enjoyed it. Now with this book, I do, it is very obviously a product of its time. But I do still think that there are some very really good nuggets in it. and that, like, honestly, it's been somewhat of a confirmation for me for a lot of things that I've been feeling. So, like, just how key love is to our everyday life and our everyday existence, and how important it is for people, and also just how, like, the lack of love and how it shows up in society is actually very harmful and a detriment, and that, like, in viewing and encouraging a, a love within and throughout society could be more beneficial to, like, not just ourselves but to everyone around us. And I thought it was really, really good. I don't want to go too deep into the book in case anyone wants to read it. I don't want to do any spoilers. But if you check out the book and you really like it and you want to talk about it in the chat below, let's talk about it. We can do just that. But yeah, that's actually all I have for you all this week. I hope you all have a really good day. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being. Have a good rest of your day. Bye.